Thank you, Steffi. Nick, thank you very much for joining us at DLD. I heard from a very trusted source that it's your first time back in Bavaria since 36 years.
Yeah.
I can't recall, were you in Unterpfaffenhofen or Oberpfaffenhofen?
Ich habe einen Schulaustausch gemacht in einem Vorort von München, Unterpfaffenhofen. Ich war in der Schule Unterpfaffenhofen Gymnasium vor 36 Jahren. Das ist mein erstes Mal zurück. And I certainly wouldn't have guessed as a school child then that I would be talking to such a Facebook-friendly crowd as this 36 years later.
Who already applauded once.
I know.
We'll see whether we can match the standing ovation.
I won't be able to match, I can tell you.
So we're going to do this like with every panel a journalist and a member of Facebook is on. So I'm going to throw as much criticism at you as possible. You're going to try and defend yourself the best way you can, while I try and interrupt you immediately to throw more criticism at you.
Right.
Okay.
Feels just like my old political life. Yeah.
Exactly. So just as a personal disclaimer, Sir Nick and I have a joint history because we were on the same commission on transatlantic integrity. Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity. I'm still on it. You're not because Facebook stole you away from us, but no hard feelings. I think that despite working for Facebook, you still care about election integrity.
Of course.
So if we talk about new rules for the internet, my first question would be, what has Facebook implemented, what will it implement to secure the integrity of this year's US presidential election?
So I think that, I mean, obviously what happened in the 2016 US presidential election, deeply shocked everybody. I mean, not just Facebook, but nobody was quite aware at the time of the attempts that Russian operatives and others made to interfere in that election. And so since then, a number of things have changed. If you look last year, for instance, over 50 networks, nefarious foreign networks trying to interfere in various elections around the world. We identified over 50 of them and took them down, which compares to only one 2 years earlier. We've had, of course, a large number of elections. I mean, elections happen all the time. Over the last few months, we had the Indian election, the US midterm elections, the European elections, the British elections, we've had just the Taiwanese elections. And we now have thousands of people working on trying to protect each of those elections. And whilst we constantly learn from each election, I think we're just getting better and better at protecting those elections from foreign interference, but also making sure that the content on our platforms does not lead to deliberate electoral misinformation. So, I mean, no one, of course, no one tends to believe what Facebook says about itself, but if you look at some of the independent analyses from the University of Michigan, Stanford University, Le Monde did some research project, they assess that the amount of fake news and misinformation has declined by at least 50% since 2016. So there's still a lot to be done. But I think there's been a huge switch since 2016 to protect elections, and, touch wood, we will be able to do a lot better in the US presidential elections this year than occurred 4 years ago.
But it's not just about foreign interference, is it? And when you say it declined by 50%, it always depends on how much is 100%. So it may still be and probably is massive. So I'm wondering, unlike Google and Twitter, I think, Facebook is not limiting political targeting when it comes to ads. And you said that hardly anybody believes Facebook talking about Facebook, but I tend to believe Andrew Bosworth, who's formerly in charge of Facebook ads, who says that he believes that Facebook did help President Trump to become president, not because of Russia, but because of the ads. So while you say disinformation is trying to be sort of thrown out of Facebook, and you're making a lot of effort to do that, you're still allowing politicians to sell ads, or you basically sell ads to them, and make money out of politicians who put disinformation in their ads, and you then amplify that.
So I think, look, I think there's been a lot of crossed wires on this thing. let's take the United States, where this is obviously, it's a globally important debate, but it's one that is particularly relevant now in the run-up to the US presidential elections. Broadcasters in the United States are not entitled under law, under FCC law, to block political advertisements because of the content of them. As you know, to us Europeans, there is a long-standing tradition which predated social media and Facebook of very aggressive US political attack ads being run on, particularly on broadcasters. Cable outlets are slightly different, they're regulated differently. But so the stance that we're taking is not an outlier, it's the stance that has been in place in the US politics for a long period.
Why is Google and Twitter, why are they taking different stances when it comes to targeting?
So everyone is taking slightly different stances. So we, unlike Twitter and Google, now have the world's most advanced transparency mechanisms for political ads. So it's impossible now on Facebook to run political ads in the dark, to target them at people in the dark so that you don't know who is being targeted by the political campaigns. Well, you shake your head, that is a fact. There is no political ads library which is, and we've recently just announced some new further changes to that political ads library. So in the presidential election this year...
Sometimes they tend to vanish from that library. Like,
sorry?
I think sometimes these ads tend to vanish from the library as well, as I think...
Well, they stay there for 7 years, so they vanish after 7 years.
Or in between.
Well, look, I'm sure what you might be referring to is maybe there's an ad that wasn't properly logged or categorized. It's a new thing. No one's done it. But since you ask about the other industry, so you have 3 different approaches between Twitter, Google, and Facebook. Facebook, far more than Twitter and Google, is investing in industry-leading transparency and also giving users control. So if users don't want to see or want to see fewer political ads, they can press a button and they receive fewer political ads. But crucially, unlike 2016 or unlike the Brexit referendum, where ads were run on Facebook apps and it was impossible for rival campaigns to see who was doing what, that has changed utterly. So now campaigns in real time can see who's paying for the ad, who they're trying to target, what their message is, what the different variants are of their message, and so on. Google has you speak to them, has altered some aspects of their targeting, and Twitter have decided not to run political ads altogether. None of those, Facebook, Google, or Twitter, are doing what some people demand, which is that Silicon Valley companies should start vetting the accuracy or veracity of political ads. And I think the reason why no one's doing that, and no one ever did, there wasn't a single political ad that was fact-checked by any of these big platforms in the European elections, the midterm elections, is because that would then arrogate, of course, to private companies an extraordinarily powerful role of deciding what is and what is not true, what is, and I know this from 20 years in politics, political speech is by definition, it's a sort of form of caricature. Politicians caricature their virtues, caricature their opponents' vices, and the idea that private companies should be the people to draw that fine line seems to us, and indeed clearly to other Silicon Valley companies, as an inappropriate power.
I think we're going to come back to that inappropriate power. It was already mentioned by Steffi, the author of Zucked, Roger McNamee, spoke here earlier. I think he received standing ovations. You already said you're not going to manage to do that. But from what I take it, he calls Mark Zuckerberg basically a threat to democracy. He said Zuck kills democracy. His claim is that Facebook could have been the hero of something, but chose another path, and that through algorithmical amplification, as you just explained, that maybe this year's election will be slightly worse when it comes to disinformation and hate speech and all those sort of atrocities, but that it still chose the wrong path when it comes to what is actually good for democracy. I heard from you haven't read the book, so it's quite hard to sort of take up that argument, but what would you reply?
Well, obviously I don't agree with that. I think, look, social media, when you have a third of the world's population communicating on your apps and services, inevitably, human nature being what it is, you have good and you have bad. It's like any technology. A car is a wonderful, liberating technology. You put a terrorist behind the wheel of a car and it becomes a murder weapon.
So what if you amplify? What if you amplify the terrorist's impact?
If we were amplifying in the way that is described, why then would a company like Facebook, for instance, Last year, we took down 7 million items of hate speech content, the vast majority of which, 80% of which, we identified before anyone reported it. Why would we employ 35,000 people to... I think what is often misunderstood is when people talk about algorithmic ranking, I think sometimes people overcomplicate what that means. What the ranking algorithm on Facebook news feeds is trying to do is trying to deal with a very simple dilemma. And the dilemma is this, that every news feed, for those of you who still use Facebook, I suspect some of you might not by the sounds of it, but anyway, for those of you who still do, each of your news feeds is entirely unique to you, right? So it's curated according to your interests, to the groups, to your families, and most importantly, the most powerful signal we use is our friends. Now, the problem is most people, of course, look at their news feed waiting for the bus, in the queue in the supermarket, and yet there's an almost infinite amount of content. So what the ranking algorithm principally does is decide what we think you might want to see first. The research we've done is overwhelming. Of course people don't want to see clickbait, don't want to see polarizing things, don't want to see hate speech. And that's why not only do we suppress that stuff, we ban it. So there's a huge amount of content that is not just downgraded.
Okay, you're totally right not to overcomplicate things. And you just said, okay, 7 million of pieces of whatever has been taken down, which is always hard for journalists like me to sort of put in relation to how much is actually out there. So 7 million sounds like a huge number, but if it's coming from 70 million or 700 million.
No, as I say, we publish, we're the only company that does this. We publish every year, so you can look at exactly how we arrive at those statistics. And the thing that is tricky about hate speech is that hate speech is defined slightly differently from one culture to another. Okay, we think we're getting better and better at...
Let's make it less complicated, as you said. So there's been a case in Germany, Renate Künast, which I'm sure you've heard of. And as you know the German language, as we've seen quite well, she was slandered, she was insulted as a dirty C word, I'm not going to repeat that here, which for German, and I don't really get why 3 judges in Berlin saw it otherwise, is one of the worst insults, and if that word isn't insulting in legal terms, I don't know which word in the German language would be. So what Renate Künast did was to try to get the identities of the people who insulted her that way from Facebook. And in not even a perfect world, but in actually just quite a normal world, I'd have thought that Facebook would sort of oblige and tell Renate Künast, okay, these are the names of the people who insulted you that way, and you can now go off to sue them. But Facebook didn't. So she went off to sue Facebook, and got the verdict that astonished this nation last year, with 3 Berlin judges saying, no, it's sort of, it's at the border of what freedom of expression still allows, but it's not crossing that border. So when you tell me that you're doing your utmost to make social media a better place, which is bottom line what Facebook is saying, why not just help that woman, that politician,
so with respect,
to go after the people?
With respect, you've got some very important facts wrong. We're not party to that legal case. She's taken a case in the civil courts, quite understandably, to find out exactly who issued these insults. We play no. Of course, if the court says you, Facebook, must give Renate Künast...
Forget the courts. Why not give it to Renate Künast?
No one believes that what you should do is give data about individuals unless it's done so in a clearly lawful and legally binding way. So, but can I just complete this?
Yeah, sure.
The slanders and the language which was used about her, the posts were taken down by the perpetrators of that. Since then, the rules have been changed in Facebook such that that language would not be permitted. I think the court said, and I have to say I was very struck by this because it's just flagrantly wrong, that Facebook has defended that language. Of course we haven't defended that language.
No, and I'm not saying you defended the language.
Well, you have said that she took Facebook to court. That's not actually what happened. The court case is on a rather important point of law, which of course we will abide by. I, by the way, was as surprised as anyone else by the court ruling when it said that kind of language was covered by free expression. Very surprised indeed. I'm both personally and also on behalf of Facebook really surprised. Of course we will do what the court, I think they're now looking at the case again.
The question is a different one.
But what you're asking is an extraordinary one, which is we should in the absence of a court of a legal ruling to do so,
because you know
give
why?
information. Well, hang on, I'll tell you why that's dangerous. Because in your industry, in media and elsewhere, very, very quickly, what you will find in a whole range of different situations, you will be giving personal information.
The trouble is that if you look.
No, but can I just? It's such a point.
I think you get the point.
That you cannot use Facebook unless you say who you are, but in a law-abiding country, giving personal, and particularly a country in Germany, which quite rightly has this long tradition of being very careful about when personal data is provided.
You have prosecutors who are totally overflooded by all sorts of hate speech, insult, properly legal or illegal postings on Facebook. So they will not be able to manage those floods. So you're already saying...
This is not illegal speech.
It is. So come on. You're taking a lot of stuff down, but what if people want to go after the people who actually insulted them? You're a private company, Renate Künast is a private person, and you're saying you always have to go through the courts to actually get the data. You could yourself find, okay, this word is something...
So I'm trying to provide you with an answer.
My point, yeah.
Yes, we are going to be, like everybody in the industry, I suspect in your industry as well, very, very careful about the points at which, for content which is disgusting but not illegal, we are going to be very careful at giving over, however strongly people feel about it, of course, personal data. But if we are told to do so, and as I say, I'm personally very surprised by the initial ruling of the court.
Yeah, we
play no role in that court. We play no role in that court case whatsoever, contrary to what you said. It's actually the language which is used about Renate Künast is not allowed by Facebook rules. And if it happened today, it would be blocked. The posts that are in question and the 22 other individuals involved have all had their messages and their posts removed. But I would just suggest to you that in a society where we quite rightly try and strike the right balance between different and often conflicting values of free expression, of privacy, but also of recourse and of transparency, how that balance is struck is one at the end that shouldn't just be left to the discretion of different private companies coming up with their own different approaches.
You could involve civil courts, but let me just take
that... But it is a civil court. It is a civil court.
But
it's not
making very, very, very complicated. It's a civil court that, in the end, decides whether the prosecution is allowed to get the data from you, which would then happen. It's not the civil court that...
Of course we'll give the data if the court rules that, but I think it's the right way.
I think, in the end, it makes it extremely complicated for people who are on the sort of victim side of hate speech. I don't particularly like the term hate speech because it's not a legal term, but who are insulted and who are slandered, to go after the people who do it. And Facebook is, in a way, by saying, no, we leave that all to the courts, is sort of aiding and abetting. So my hypothesis, when you call for, which you regularly do, for new rules for the internet to be set by legislators, to be set by parliaments, by states, is that because it makes it easier for Facebook to say, as long as the states, as long as the parliaments haven't decided on new rules, we won't do it either. So you sort of shifting responsibility.
Well, with respect, it's a very cynical question. Of course we don't want to... Look, we have a major societal issue. We have technologies which have erupted in a very short space of time. Facebook is a very young company. It was only founded Roger Federer became world #1 in men's tennis the day before Mark Zuckerberg and others founded Facebook. So the Federer era is longer than the Facebook era. This is a young industry, and the young industry has erupted in our society, and it's had huge transformative effects. I personally think the net benefits to businesses, to communities, to families, to political movements, to campaign movements, far outweighs the dark and the negative side. But of course there is negative, of course there's dark, because people do vile things to each other. They did it on email, they did it by letter, they did it by telephone, they did it on the radio, and they're now doing it on social media. So our task as a society is to minimize the bad while protecting the good. And of course, that is a role which in the end must be, in mature democracies like Germany and in the European Union and the US and so on, must be done by legislators, by governments accountable to the people. As we've discussed earlier, big companies like Twitter, Google, and Facebook are taking distinctly different approaches, which they'll all individually defend, about how political ads work on our platforms. But in the end, it shouldn't be left to Twitter, Google, or Facebook to make those decisions, because it's not our democracy, it's the people's, and the people's representatives have to decide. So what I hope we can do is move beyond shouting at the problem, which understandably a lot of people do, and a lot of problems are being created by the industry itself, to fixing it. And you can only fix it, not for cynical motives, you can only fix this by legislators and regulators setting down new rules, just as they set down new rules for cars, for every new technology which has ever erupted in the history of time.
Because, as you say, time, and we're running out of it. 2 questions left, and then to the audience. The general theme of DLD this year is, what are you adding? So I think we all know people who say Facebook is adding a lot of hatred, Facebook is adding like the match to countries which are a tinderbox. We know Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg would say Facebook is adding voice, is adding freedom of expression, is adding community sharing, etc. So what, from your personal perspective, because you've been with Facebook for a year and a half now, what do you think Facebook is adding?
Well, I believe, I strongly believe that in the end, giving millions, billions of people the right to express themselves, to communicate themselves, and to reach out to others can be disruptive, because for a long time you've had gatekeepers, whether, dare I say it, it's the traditional media or in hierarchical societies, whether it's political or religious or ethnic forms of authority. It is, of course, a remarkably liberating thing. And, of course, the ingenious thing about Facebook apps is because it's paid for by online advertising, you don't need to pay a fee or a subscription to use it. And that means it's freely available to a sheep shearer in the outback in Australia, to a student in Guatemala, just as it is to a fancy lawyer in Berlin. I think that is a remarkable thing. I think since you asked about what it adds to the world, I think the bit that's often forgotten is what a democratizing effect social media's had economically. Because traditionally, only large corporations had the marketing budgets to pour into advertising campaigns, billboards, television, magazines, and so on, to reach customers.
Big media companies.
The extraordinary thing about social media, I mean, we're just releasing this week a report by a Danish consultancy called, I think, Copenhagen Economics, about the effect on particularly small and medium-sized businesses in Europe. And about 25 million small and medium-sized businesses use Facebook to reach customers, and they're able to do so very inexpensive. In fact, 95% of them don't pay anything. They use these free tools to reach and identify customers, and Copenhagen Economics, this consultancy, estimates that has, over the last period of time, generated about £200 billion worth of economic activity, helped to support about 3 million jobs. And I think that's a really important and often overlooked contribution to society, is that because these tools are so readily available. I was reading about a small company in Hamburg set up by 3 guys about 4 or 5 years ago called Brooklyn Salon or something, Brooklyn, I forgot, Groomers or something, and they sell perfumes and facial creams and so on for men. And they've basically identified customers in about 36 countries only using Facebook and other media platforms. That, I think, is a powerful economic, it's a spreading of economic benefit, which I think is considerable.
Me working for not one of the smallest to mid-sized, but rather big media companies, we could get into a banter on how sort of data sharing and revenue sharing for bigger companies may not work out so well, but that's a whole new different discussion. So my last question to you, when we talk about new rules for the internet, which rules do you personally apply for your family, for your own media use, for the media use of your 3 children back at home?
So I never really, 20 years of politics, I never talked about my children, so I'm not going to change, I'm afraid, that habit of a lifetime. But Miriam and I, we have an 18-year-old and a 15-year-old and a 10-year-old, 3 boys, who are just like all kids. They spend far too much time on their screens. We, on the whole, I mean, different parents do different things. We, on the whole, believe in trying to constantly educate them about what is great about the technology that they have available to them, but also what is not so great, rather than trying to very precisely control or ration time or content. But lots of friends of mine, take a different, more interventionist approach. We kind of believe in the long run they're going to have to grow up and stand on their own 2 feet, so they've got to just learn. But on the whole, I'm like any parent. Sometimes I go, please put your screens down.
Do you check their screen time?
Sorry?
Do you check their screen time?
Yeah, but not zealously from time to time.
Okay. Do you check your screen time?
No.
Ever?
Not really.
Okay.
Do you want me to?
Well,
Well, since you did actually ask me earlier, and it said 24 minutes a day, which I don't believe.
I hope,
too
I hope
little.
you're right not to believe it, because otherwise your job is maybe
That's
a
right.
bit
Far too
risky.
late, exactly.
24 minutes. I think we have time for 2 questions. Just housekeeping. Could you make it a question and not a statement? That would be really, really helpful.
Hi, my name is Brittany Kaiser. I'm a data rights activist. Full transparency, I was the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, and I spend a lot of time testifying against your company. I have one question, because you're talking about Facebook wanting to enforce laws, and that laws and regulations are what you guys are going to abide by. So we have laws against voter suppression. We have laws against slander and libel. We have laws against incitement of violence and racial hatred. So why is Facebook calling the moderation of political content, which those laws should be enforced in political content, why is Facebook claiming that that is censorship? Because it's not. Actually, my right to free speech ends where your human rights begin.
I don't think we do. I don't think we do call it censorship. Of course, you need to strike the right balance. That's why we have our own standards in addition to the law, which go well beyond the law, which prescribe content that is particularly that threatens real-world harm or violence. And we have both human moderators, but also increasingly sophisticated machine tools that identify that content and block it or take it down on an increasingly large scale. And as you know, in the States, particularly but not exclusively from the right, the complaint is that we take too much content down, and then there are others who say we don't take enough content down. But of course that is a balance. It's one of the most tricky cultural, legal and ethical balances in any modern society. Of course, the law is the law, but the law, interestingly, in most jurisdictions, doesn't cover law, which we just talked about earlier, material or content that is deeply offensive, but is not illegal under law. And then, of course, we have our rules, other companies have their rules. We iterate them all the time. Every 2 weeks, we publish how we change the community standards. We work with experts and academics around the world. All of that's completely open. We consult with them about where we should tighten it up, whether we should loosen them up. So no, we absolutely, of course that's not censorship. That's abiding by the laws of society.
Thank you. I do think you guys can do better at that, but I appreciate it.
I'm sure we can do better.
Question number 2.
Sure. Hi, hello. So my life has moved from like 14 years ago hanging out with Zook at Davos, and November 13, 2015, 19 of my friends were killed during a Paris attack. The only reason I'm standing here is I was late. And a large part of this was actually organized through social media. So I have a few questions, because also our YGL friend, Joe Cox, as you know, has also been killed with this era of madness. First, do you acknowledge we live in a different world that we used to do? The second one is, Apple doesn't allow porn. Disney doesn't allow porn. It's a business decision. It's not about trying to take over everything. It's a business decision. So if you wanted to do this, it's just a business decision. The third thing is, all the arguments you gave are right. But if you look at the evolution of technology, we came from the world of online communities, thousands of people, to social media, millions of people, to platform, billions of people. And I do not believe that the rules we designed, because what happened in the US, what happened in Europe, were designed for social media. It was designed for bloggers, for things like that. They were not designed for platforms. And one of the main problems we have now is we're using the argument of social media that is 15 years old. Millions of people, manageable, to deal with an enormous complexity of people and algorithm that I know. I have so many friends at Facebook, a lot of them knows that they don't really know what's happening. So it's a Pandora box. And when we see the urgency, I mean, look at what's happening in Europe. I mean, I met you 10 or 12 years ago at YGL, and I was actually very hopeful, because I found one of almost all the people I've seen. There was Boris Johnson and you, and I found you were kind of the most reasonable guy at the time. Look
You're
at what's
setting quite a
happening.
low hurdle, but anyway, go on.
Look at the threat of democracy. I mean, I have friends who are running an action in Sweden and Denmark, and when I hear about what's going on in Denmark and Sweden, there used to be like heavens. So question is, is there an urgency? And as a European, I believe you're still a European at heart, don't you think that we need to fix these things really fast? Because if we don't, I mean, what happens?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm a pragmatic person, and I strongly, one of the reasons I was keen when offered to work with Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg at Facebook is I believed all my life that you can either just admire a problem, vilify a problem, or try and fix it. And so I strongly, strongly agree with you about the urgency to fix some of the dark side of both the internet and social media as well. I'm not as pessimistic as you seem to imply. I'll give you an example, just one example. Several years ago, you're quite right, the big Silicon Valley companies were not nearly effective enough in dealing with terrorist and extremist content on their platforms. Now, I'll just give you one example, but I can give you many others. Just now, Al-Qaeda and Daesh-related material, over 99% of it is identified, because a lot of it is quite ritualized, so it can be recognized by machine learning systems, is recognized and blocked on Facebook's platforms, and I think the other companies are doing a similarly better job before anyone reports it. That is an absolute transformation. We have just set up this year something called the Global Internet for Counterterrorism, and it's a self-standing body, sort of NGO, if you like, with legal independence, funded, however, by the industry, Microsoft, Twitter, Facebook, and so on. It has a database of about 200 hashes, digital fingerprints, which are used to identify extremists and terrorists planning acts of terrorism on their platforms. We have a new crisis protocol, which means that when, God forbid, terrorist incidents happen, and I'm afraid they happened before Facebook was invented or before social media was invented and will always be with us. Terrorism, violent extremism has always been with us in society. It wasn't invented 15 years ago. We are now becoming much, much more effective, not least also with security services from different governments who are also in that body. I just give you an illustration, not because I say that's perfect, but because those changes, for instance, the GIF-CT as it's called, has been established just in the short time I've been working in Silicon Valley over the last year. It's a transformation in the way in which the industry is cooperating together to deal with something that everybody agrees. I totally agree with you, not least with the harrowing memories you have of, I suppose, the Bataclan attack you're referring to. So I understand the urgency. I just worry sometimes that when we make steps forward, people don't recognize that they're important steps. And if we don't recognize that we can make progress, all we're left with is a sort of techno-pessimism, a sort of techno-fatalism, that it's all terrible and it can never be fixed, can never be changed. I don't believe that, because I think that leads to stasis, I think that leads to paralysis, I think it leads to inaction. And that's why I, unlike you perhaps, agree about the urgency, but I'm a little bit more optimistic that things can be fixed.
We have one last question, okay, pause. Because Steffi Czani allowed a third one. Here you go.
I'm Werner. I work for what someone called a bookshop. If you don't pay for the product, you are the product. And I like to believe that sort of with all the Cambridge Analytics things that have happened, for most of the digital natives, we understand that we are the products if you use these. I like to believe 95% of your customers do not understand that they are the product. What would you want to do for them to make them realize that they are selling their data, or that they actually have precious goods in their hands that are being sold to others?
So I draw a distinction, which is that, I mean, look, a company like Facebook has really an option of two basic business models. The current one we have, which is funded through personalized ads, which are in turn derived from data that people are prepared to share with us, so that, like all ads, it can be the ads can be relevant to you. There's no point me having on my news feed an ad for a shoe shop in Adelaide because I'm never going to buy shoes in Adelaide. So, of course, that's the whole point of ads, always has been. It's more sophisticated online, of course, but it's the same principle as ads, which is you try and show ads to people who are going to be relevant to them. The alternative business model is a subscription model where people pay, whatever it is, $15, $20 a month and so on. Which, of course, you could do, I guess, on a social media platform like Facebook. It would have one dramatic effect, however. It would mean that the millions, if not billions of people, particularly in Africa, Asia, Latin America and elsewhere, who use these products without paying for them, would not be able to do so. So it suddenly become basically a sort of rich world product only. I think I agree with I strongly agree with the implicit suggestion in your question that we can and must do more to make that relationship more explicit. I don't agree with the characterization of the way you say it, because we don't actually sell people's data, but that's a separate debate. But I agree with you that we all know that when you see these long lists of sort of consent orders, you know, do you tick? You tick them, people don't read them in full, the lawyers insist that all the detail needs to be included. I do think that's an area where we got better and better and better. So I'll give you an example. Facebook, I think it's the first company in the industry to do this, we're starting to roll out a new tool, which you can find on Facebook, called Off-Facebook Activity, so that you can see all the signals that Facebook receives through cookies and pixels when you go and visit I'm talking about shoe shops for some reason, a bookshop, a shoe shop or whatever, and Facebook says you've been to that bookshop or that shoe shop, you'll see on this thing with transparency, which is industry leading, exactly what signals have been received. And crucially, you can say, I don't want those signals to be sent to Facebook or shared with Facebook in that way again. So I do think there are things we can do. I think the thing can be made simpler, clearer. I personally, perhaps unlike you, believe that of those two business models, an advertising-driven business model which allows people then to use it without having to pay a subscription is actually a very ingenious and good thing. But I accept that, I think things are going to, of course rules are going to change. Of course companies like Facebook rightly are going to be put under considerable pressure in the years ahead, regulated in different ways. There's going to be debates about how data is held, stored, aggregated, monetized. All of that, I think, will shift. But I personally think the basic relationship is an ingenious one, which I hope is retained.
So I think among the many things we may disagree on, I think there's one thing we can agree on, that Facebook got itself a very charming Vice President Policy and Communications. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being here. Cheers.